Hi everyone. I hope you all are having a nice break. Um, like I told you this past week that I just was going to upload this kind of summarization of chapter seven. And again, if you want to listen to it now while you have some time, you're more than welcome to. But just again, please be aware that this particular lecture, the material covered will be in your next exam. So, if you don't have to watch it now or this coming week, but just please be aware that again, at one point in time, you will have to watch it before your next exam in early April. But again, I don't want to take up that much of the time, so I just want to quickly get into it and start from here. So this particular chapter will kind of cover I guess the cultural ramifications of independence. Last time that we talked, we were talking about kind of the actual political and economic situation regarding the Revolutionary War, but it's important that we kind of talk about how exactly the revolution affects people actually here, and obviously not just people seeking independence from Britain, but also what about Native Americans, especially the issue of slavery. All of these things are connected and intertwined, so I just wanted to kind of get into the detail of this, or kind of details into this kind of whole, all the shockwaves of a revolution and eventually independence. Now, the revolution also unleashed debates about struggles and economic and social otherwise, and all of a sudden now you have this idea of freedom. And as we've discussed already in a multitude of ways, the concept of freedom obviously changes from person to person and from idea. But you do begin to see this idea of equality. Now, needless to say, when we talk about equality, they're obviously talking about one man, particularly a white man, not being superior than another, especially when it comes to issues of nobility. That's, I guess, that's really what I'm getting for it all. What we call today hereditary aristocracy. In other words, in countries with monarchies and nobility, you have dukes and lords and earls and all these other titles of nobility. It was quickly pretty much determined during the revolution and a little bit before that the concept of hereditary aristocracy is incompatible with the idea of freedom, because again, it puts others above everyone else. Now, obviously, this is kind of hypocritical considering that slavery is a thing. We'll get to that in just a minute. Now, but again, this is kind of emphasized in this whole concept of the Declaration of Independence assertion that all men are created equal. So again, what this is referring to more than anything else, that what they're referring to specifically is this rejection of hereditary aristocracy. Um, Now, keep in mind that when you begin to see the debate about what exactly the future of this new country should be or who should determine it, you begin to see this kind of debate regarding democracy. Remember, democracy, this rule of the people, this rule of the general consensus, and many, especially in the intellectual elite of this new American society, it's one that is often rejected, and we'll talk more about the rejection of this democracy when we talk about the creation of what becomes the United States Constitution. But um, nevertheless, you do begin to see, even people who prior really didn't have a lot of say. Remember, up until this point, participation in colonial government was very limited to large landowners. Maybe about 20% of the population could actually, engage fully in this, governmental process. Um, Even with this rejection of democracy, as we'll talk about next week, you do begin to see this emphasis on participation, where just small farmers, laborers, all of a sudden now are becoming more and more involved in governance. Now, the elite of Pennsylvania, I do want to kind of focus on the Pennsylvania because all of a sudden now, it's an interesting thing where the elite of other states, particularly in Virginia and Massachusetts, for the most part, also supported independence. But in Pennsylvania, most of the um, kind of elite of Pennsylvania were comfortable being with England and being British subjects, and pretty much just rejected this concept of independence. As we'll talk about, many of them fled and either went to Canada or went to other parts of the British Empire. So, with the political leadership of Pennsylvania basically abandoning the colony, you have this new infusion of patriotic Americans who kind of enter into this assembly to create a new constitution for what becomes the state of Pennsylvania. And all of a sudden now they have a very radical constitution, one that establishes an annual elected one house legislature, which, as we see, which again is pretty radical to begin with, allowing tax-paying men to vote and abolishing the office of the governor. So, I probably should probably note that this is only temporary. This only lasts for a few years, but nonetheless goes to show you just the rejection of any type of centralized authority, where even the position of governor is eliminated, and all of a sudden now you have an assembly, a legislature that will be reelected once a year. So it's a very interesting document. It kind of shows you where the mindset of many of these young patriots are, where they just want a complete rejection of the old system of governance. Now, aside from Pennsylvania, you have other states all writing their own constitutions or writing their own form of government, and each state was different. And you have this debate between what we call unicameral and bicameral houses. In other words, do the state assemblies, the state legislatures, do they, are they one chamber, where you just basically have one legislative, or you have one house of elected officials, or do you have a bicameral house where you have, like, for example, in the state of Texas, we have a Senate and we have a legislature. In the federal government, we have a Congress and we have a Senate. So so that's what bicameral refers to. And again, you do have some states that adopt a unicameral house. Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Vermont, for example, are the only of the or the only 12, or I'm sorry, the only three of the 12 states, original states, who actually adopted unicameral houses. Everyone else adapted two house legislatures for various reasons. Now, the issue of property qualifications all of a sudden became incredibly controversial. Essentially, you begin to see northern states include more people into the elective process. All right, it's not to say that they limited proper requirements all in all, but for the most part, they were able to ease up on these requirements. Now, where you see the least democratization, where you see the least, the more restrictive measures to prevent democratization, is in the South. States like Georgia and South Carolina, you have basically, deference to this. Remember, who really controls, these areas, these colonies these former colonies now of Georgia and South Carolina, are the wealthy landowners, the wealthy elite of society, and they're not ones to let go of power easy. And so, while you have states in the North, kind of increasing the number of participants in government, in the South, you begin to see it incredibly restricted. Um, Now, by the 1780s, with the exceptions of Virginia, Maryland, and New York, a large majority of adult white male population could meet voting requirements. And until 1807, property-owning women in New Jersey can vote. New Jersey had actually one of the more democratic governments up until 1807, which included free blacks. But, and again, we'll talk about this as over the next couple of weeks. You begin to see even those states who had originally agreed or allowed for freed black men to vote, you begin to see them becoming more restrictive as time progresses. So you begin to see, again, as we'll talk about this next week, you do see this emphasis of democratization. However, it is one that is incredibly limited, especially in the South. All right, and as we'll see, when you begin to see the actual the foundation of the Constitution, it is one that does not emphasize democracy. All right, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about the Constitution next week. Now, um, with this idea of freedom, all of a sudden comes this issue of religion. Now, remember, technically speaking, every up until independence, every single person in the English colonies here was technically a member of the Anglican Church. You had to, by law, be a member of the church. And so, with this idea of freedom comes this idea that should people be able to worship their religion freely without having to commit themselves to a state church. And so, you know, during the course of the revolution, you begin to see this kind of idea evolve. Now, it's important to note that, first off, with the majority of Catholic Americans joining the side of the revolution, you begin to see kind of this changing of, or this more tolerance of Catholics within the colonies. Keep in mind that, needless to say, there's still discrimination against Catholics. The idea of Catholics in governance in many ways was still one that was very suspicious, and where Catholics were met with distrust, but nonetheless, they had proved their loyalty by fighting on the side of the Patriots. And so you do begin to see states, at the very least, allowing Catholics the right to, to practice their religion freely. Now, with the end of British rule, you begin to see this kind of rejection of the state religion, and even then, while many believed that religion was necessary as a foundation of public morality, the idea of a state-instituted religion for many, regardless of what religion they were, was simply just not acceptable. And so you begin to see, again, it was pretty much a consensus by this point in time that a state religion, regardless of what it is, was just simply not going to be part of this American fabric. Um, Now, aside from this kind of kind of tying into this concept of, or this rejection of state religion, you begin to see this insistence on the separation of church and state, where you begin to see, especially those intellectuals that emphasize deism, or were deists in terms of their religious philosophy, emphasize this idea of separating governance from the church. And several states during the Constitution disestablished established churches, depriving them of specific public funding and legal privileges. All right, and you even have seven of the first 13 states begin with declarations of all included a commitment to a free exercise of religion. Now, it's still important to note that you still have some states banning certain religious freedoms. For example, most of the states, with the exception of New York, ban Jews from voting or holding office, and Catholics gained the right to worship without persecution throughout the state. So you do begin to see some instances of anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism still kind of represented, but Catholics seem to have gotten more of their restrictions eased, as opposed to Jews, who still very much are oppressed and restricted throughout these new states. Now, kind of one of the big pushers of this separation of church and state was Thomas Jefferson. He was very involved in the creation of the Virginia Constitution, and he even wrote the legislation called the Bill of Establishing Religious Freedom, that essentially insisted that you have a separation of church and state. And the idea behind this is that the states themselves, and Virginia specifically, and the United States in general, should be welcome to everyone, regardless of their religion. And so by insisting on a religious, a governance or a state religion, they felt that they were basically excluding a lot of people. And so, again, Thomas Jefferson, among others, was incredibly important in insisting on this concept of religious freedom, because of, again, the desire to attract more people to eventually move into the United States and be kind of safe in their sense of liberty. Now, as religious liberty expanded, some church authority was undermined. Thanks to religious freedom, the early republic witnessed an amazing proliferation of religious denominations. And so, with all of a sudden this idea of free exercise of religion, you begin to see many people kind of start to think independently of their churches. All of a sudden saying, well, yeah, I like my church, but I don't agree with this particular phrasing, or I don't like this particular dogma, or I don't like the way this is done. And would eventually found their own churches, based on what they interpret. Like today, for example, if you wanted to open up a church based on your own interpretation of Christianity, or even just if you wanted to open up a church based on the teachings of the Jedi for Star Wars, you are more than welcome to. This is the religious proliferation that begins and continues to this day. As of today, there are more than 1,300 organized religions in the United States. All right, and again, the tradition of this goes back to during this period in time where you begin to see people becoming secure with their ability to kind of question what was going on with their churches and reject certain ideas. Excuse me. And so, nevertheless, you begin to see religious and secular language merge in the struggle for independence, and it creates what scholars call this Christian republicanism. Now, nevertheless, despite this emphasis on religious freedom and the separation of church and state, most people believed that religion did provide a foundation for morality. That churches and organized religion in general provide a sense of guidance when it comes to morals and ethics, and so people began to kind of blend this idea of of being a virtuous and moral person and tying it with the sense of republican duty. All right, so while you have this emphasis of free religion and this emphasis on the separation of church and state, many of the early founding fathers emphasized this need for virtue and this need for a organized or organized religions to essentially provide that. Right, so you do have this kind of difference in opinion. Now, by this point in time, and not just in the United States, but in Europe as well, you begin to see many of the learned elite begin emphasizing this idea of free labor. And we talked about this briefly, this belief that you as an individual have a right to choose whatever career path you want. If you want to become a baker, you're more than welcome to. If you want to become a school teacher, you're more than free to do so. And so this idea of free labor, needless to say, is something that becomes kind of embedded into American society from an early point in time, and even again during this early period of revolutionary politics, you do have this become more and more emphasized. Now, I just want to give a quick kind of shout out to kind of the one of the early, as this revolution, just in the early days of this revolution, a English author by the name of Adam Smith writes his kind of keynote kind of emphasis um, on what this idea of free labor is. And in this book, known as The Wealth of Nations, you have this emphasis of, again, not only the idea of free labor, but the idea of what will become known as capitalism, the idea of entrepreneurship, of business, but more importantly, a government that allows these businesses to thrive and prosper. Now, it's not just, a lot is made of Adam Smith's emphasis on laissez-faire. And we'll talk more about this next week. So just, keep this in the back of your head. But this idea that government should just kind of let businesses do whatever they want and just get out of the way, that's not really what laissez-faire means. It basically means, essentially allowing a business to conduct itself, but at the same time, allowing or making sure government is there to enforce contracts, to review court cases, to prevent exploitation of labor. So there is this, role of government. It's not just letting people do whatever they want and letting business do what they want, because as I'm sure you know, businesses being allowed to do what they want back then, just like they do now, can result in bad things happening. So again, eventually, again, as you see this happening, you begin to see this emphasis on free labor. However, it's important to note that this idea of free labor, needless to say, is in direct contrast with slavery. Right. Early capitalists and early proponents of free labor were vehemently opposed to slavery, at the very least because of these economic issues. And so, you do have this struggle of trying to integrate this idea of free labor with the perpetuation of slavery. Now, to most free Americans, equality meant equal opportunity rather than equality of condition. Thomas Jefferson and others equated land with economic resources with freedom. And so it's important to note that the idea of freedom didn't necessarily mean, that everyone, is the same in terms of their condition. No, this basically meant that everyone should have an opportunity to succeed. However, it's important to note that this concept of economic opportunity is one that is very dependent on your own conditions and your own circumstances, right? So, but nonetheless, it's important to note that this is what, in terms of what this idea of economic freedom means, is more than anything else equal opportunity. Now, some Americans, so with the during the American Revolution, needless to say, the American government didn't have a lot of funds to go around to pay for stuff. And so the response by this new Congress was to basically print money. Now, at the time, how money is determined in terms of its value is by the currency backed by it, by what we call hard cash or specie. What this essentially means is gold and silver. I mean, at the end of the day, this is what it means. The problem is that Americans at this point in time do not have a lot of this gold and silver going around, so they're just publishing more money than they actually can afford. And so, needless to say, this increases inflation. So all of a sudden now, remember, keep in mind that part of this whole capitalist system is prices. Now, in a capitalist system, prices are determined by two things more than anything else at the end of the day: supply and labor, supply and demand. I was going to say labor, but that's something else. Supply and demand. This is what determines the price of everything from bread to to your cell phone. At least in a truly capitalist system. Um, However, because of inflation, all of a sudden now you begin to see merchants being forced to increase the price of their goods to kind of keep up with inflation. And needless to say, this irritates more than irritates the people. As a matter of fact, from 1776 to 1779, more than 30 incidents occurred where crowds confronted merchants. And so all of a sudden there is this inflation raises these concerns about what exactly how much do we tolerate the supply and demand and these price fluctuations. And eventually you begin to see some states and even Congress itself begin trying to freeze everything from prices to wages, trying to combat inflation. All right, but again, needless to say, this is in contrast to the spirit of um, of free market economies, because again, governments are not supposed to do that. All right, remember, wages, prices of goods are all determined by supply and demand. Now, for as much talk as we emphasize on liberty and et cetera, it's important to note that there are limits, especially when it comes to those who don't really support this idea of independence. Remember, keep in mind that not everyone in the states supports or supported independence. And there are people with legitimate grievances, with people with legitimate reasons why they wouldn't. For example, those with close economic ties to England. Right? You have a lot of the wealthy elite of the colonies, still have close ties back home, and just simply didn't see a problem with the continue. Yes, they didn't want taxation representation, but at the same time, the idea of independence was just simply not acceptable to them. Even then, you have some ethnic minorities, particularly in the frontier regions, who really, were afraid for them, afraid for themselves. They were afraid that without British protection, this new American government would oppress them because of their minority status. And even then, you also have, especially in the southern regions, the poor farmers and sharecroppers. Now, remember, especially in the places like Virginia and Maryland, uh, and even North Carolina, many of the most ardent supporters of independence were actually the planter elite. They wanted independence because they were tired of paying British taxes. And so, because of their status, many of the farmers and sharecroppers who had to deal with the wealthy elite saw this as an opportunity, saw the idea of a British victory as an opportunity for them. The hope is that once the British win this war, these wealthy planters would lose their property, would lose their influence, and all of a sudden now these poor farmers and these sharecroppers would be able to take advantage of that. So you do have people with legitimate grievances and legitimate reasons why they remain loyal to the British Crown. All in all, between 25 and 30% of the American population at this point in time still remained loyal to Britain. And you do have as many as 60,000 people either fighting for the British or even eventually leaving the United States. And we'll talk about this in a minute. Um, so in many ways, there are actually some historians who make the argument that more than anything else, yes, this is a war between the Americans and the British, but this is in many ways a civil war, right? Because again, many of these battles were fought not between British soldiers and Americans, but rather between Americans, those who supported the British Crown and those who did not. So you do have, in many instances, a civil war going on beyond just this, revolutionary war, this war for independence. Now, so as the war progressed and as money became tighter and tighter, many of the states and even the actual Congress itself began to debate legislation on the seizure of property, particularly that held by the Loyalists. And so, starting, on in the war, some of the states actually began seizing the property of loyalists, those who were not sufficiently, supportive of the patriot cause, and actually seizing their property and eventually selling it. And so you have thousands of people's property, whether it's homes or land or et cetera, being seized for the purpose of raising funds to continue fighting this war. And even then, you begin to see them being arrested, being harassed. And so, with all the talk about freedom and independence and equality above all, the loyalists, more than anything else, were all of a sudden found themselves, with their what they were arguing right now, their civil rights and their natural rights being ignored or being directly violated by the seizure of property, by these arrests, et cetera, et cetera. And needless to say, eventually this resulted in many of them simply just packing up whatever they can and leaving. When the war ended, as many as 60,000 loyalists were banished from the United States or immigrated voluntarily. Uh, Thousands of them were actually ex-slaves, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Now, the majority of these ex-colonials, these loyalists, eventually made their way up to Canada. And so all of a sudden now you have tens of thousands of these former these current loyalists making their way up north. And all of a sudden now Canada's population doubles in a period of a few years. And so, in order to kind of accommodate these new settlers, even have the creation of a new province, New Brunswick, which is located further here in this region of Canada, which still exists to this day, was actually created for the purpose of accommodating new settlers. Now, despite the fact that these individuals were loyal to the crown, they were nonetheless, in favor of self-rule. Remember, the colonists, regardless of their, loyalty to England or their favor of independence, all had participated in governance. And so when they get to Canada, they find a system of government that is a little bit different than what's going on in the old 13 colonies. And so they begin clamoring for self-rule. And eventually these calls for self-rule, eventually they influence enough so that eventually they begin calling for self-rule, excuse me, in Canada, which actually results in a rebellion in 1837 against Great Britain. So kind of one of those weird ironies and these weird kind of butterfly effects where with thousands of these loyalists who were used to self-rule in the colonies, all of a sudden they begin actually rebelling against the British themselves in the hope of maintaining a sense of home rule, which they are somewhat successful. Now, to many patriots, really what freedom meant is the freedom to go out and stake and find land for yourself. And remember, keep in mind that this land is not just unoccupied. There are millions of Native Americans still living east of the Mississippi River here. And so, needless to say, this sense of freedom, this sense of going out and finding land on your own, is in direct contrast to the sense of Native American freedom, which obviously is, maintaining a traditional homeland and maintaining your way of life. So this is why many Native Americans actually during the revolution, I didn't really talk about this, but I probably should have, is many Native Americans during around the area of the colonies actually supported the British because they realized that if the Americans won this war, this would be bad news for them. And they were exactly right. Remember, keep in mind that this area now in orange, for the most part, is now under the control of this new United States government. And the United States government has absolutely no interest in trying to maintain, this land as Native American territory. So this will cause significant issues as we continue on with this lecture series. Now, obviously, needless to say, the ultimate irony and hypocrisy of this independence movement and this, all men are created equal, is that you have a substantial number of enslaved people in the colonies. And it's not lost on them. There are people who quickly pointed out that, wait a second, there, how can we say that all men are created equal and we're wanting freedom and liberty, and yet there is absolutely no discussion on the abolition of slavery. There is no discussion on the emancipation of slaves. And so while this very powerful language of freedom and independence and the need to kind of guide your own destiny, there is no discussion on this idea of freedom on slavery whatsoever. Now, the biggest obstacle in terms of abolition, remember, and keep this term in mind because it will come up again and again and again as we continue on and for the rest of the semester. Abolition, the elimination, the destruction of slavery. Even at this point in time, there are huge obstacles to this. First of all, the majority of what we call now the founding fathers, are slave owners, particularly Washington and Jefferson, are have land holdings that contain hundreds of slaves. So not only do you have the majority of these founders being slave owners, you have many with the mentality that our freedom, and when I mean our freedom, the freedom of white people is dependent on black slavery. That we cannot truly be free if we don't have slaves to do the work. This was their mentality, and so this idea of freedom to them just simply meant freedom for white people, right? Because again, in their opinion, without black slavery, there is no white freedom. And then finally, remember, keep in mind that these are what we call chattel slaves, which implies that uh, uh, they're indeed property. And so remember, John Locke, one of the big kind of inspirations for this revolution, was incredibly adamant about not allowing the government to seize property without due process. And so all of a sudden now people are saying, well, you can't just take away my property, without any type of due process. And so you have all of these roadblocks kind of really get in the way of any type of meaningful discussion about the possibility of emancipation. Nevertheless, Nevertheless, you do have, again, people kind of tying into this idea of universal entitlement of freedom. And so, the revolution inevitably raised questions about the status of slavery in this new nation. So again, despite the fact that the majority of the white leadership in this new American government was not interested in abolition, it doesn't necessarily means that it was over and done with. Even before independence in 1700, one of the best-selling kind of novels at this point in time is The Selling of Joseph, written in 1700, which again is kind of a major influence in terms of this anti-slavery movement. Um, Now, slaves in the North and South appropriated the language of liberty for their own purposes. Slaves presented freedom petitions in New England as back as early as the 1770s. Many blacks were surprised that white America did not realize the rhetoric of revolution demanded emancipation. One of the most vocal proponents of emancipation was an ex-slave, well, actually, at the time was still a slave, turned poet named Phillis Wheatley. Her works and her her writings, kind of was clearly very inspired by things like the Declaration of Independence, this idea of freedom, but again, keep in mind that the Declaration, when it wrote all men are created equal, clearly did not have everyone in mind. Now, there was an alternative to trying to get this new American government to recognized emancipation, and that was the British. In many of the colonies, the British had promised slaves who fought for them and sided with them freedom, as nearly 100,000 slaves deserted their owners and fled to the British lines. Now, at the end of the war, over 15,000 blacks accompanied the British out of the country. Now, here's the thing: the story of these ex-slaves who escaped with the British is one that is varying and oftentimes somewhat tragic. Many of them ended up in Canada, others ended up in England, some of them ended up in Sierra Leone, a British colony in Africa, and even some actually ended up in the Bahamas to be re-enslaved in the sugar plantations of Barbados and other British holdings. So, it's a very tragic and very, dark history of these escaped slaves. That despite the fact that the British had promised them slavery, had promised their freedom, many of them found themselves to be enslaved again. Now, between 1774 and 1804, you do begin to see some of the states begin making their way towards emancipation, particularly those in the north. Basically every colony north of Maryland, which I'll show you here. I'm sorry, I can't go back here, but uh, every colony north of Maryland essentially began the process of emancipation. Now, keep in mind that abolition in the North was a very slow process, and one that typically only applied to the future children of current slave women. So it's not to say that they eventually immediately all granted slaves, as we'll discuss later on in this class. The majority of these states that did begin the process of emancipation did an incredibly slow process, all right, one that took decades, or even didn't finish until the Civil War. Now, after the war, you begin to see communities of freed blacks in places like in the South or even in the North, where you have communities that have their own churches, their schools, and leaders. And in all states except for Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia, free black men who met tax paying and property qualifications were citizens of color who could vote. All right, but again, as we'll see, it doesn't necessarily mean complete and total freedom, or at least how white Americans saw it. All right, and we'll talk about this, in the next couple of chapters. Now, the last slide I'll go over is the issue of women, because again, with all this talk about freedom and independence, needless to say, women who, again, at this point in time, are still very much legally, politically, and economically underrepresented, all of a sudden find themselves at a crossroads. Now, many women had hoped that this revolution would mark the beginning of a new era for women. And women, women just like men, oftentimes were incredibly patriotic. For example, Deborah Sampson actually dressed as a man and enlisted in the Continental Army, all right, and fought under the Continentals. This is a picture, a wood carving of Hannah Snell, who actually again joined the side of the militia, all right, armed with a musket and a tricorner hat. Now, most women didn't join the Continental Army or a militia. For the most part, most patriotic women would organize into what we call ladies' associations, who would raise funds or sew and knit uniforms or things like this to try to help the soldiers in the front lines. Now, within American households, women participated in the political discussions, at least by independence. And so you do begin to see women becoming more and more involved in this political process, although not directly. So, because remember, keep in mind that most of the colonies, actually all the colonies, and eventually the states, uh, emphasized a political or a legal system known as couverture, which essentially means that the woman's legal and political rights are technically held by her father and eventually her husband when she is married. In both law and social reality, women lack the opportunity for autonomy based on the ownership of property or control of one's own person, and hence lack the essential qualification of political participation. And so many women who entered public debate often felt the need to apologize for their forthrightness. So even women who found themselves in debates about their rights and their freedoms all of a sudden found themselves to be accused of being overreactionary or just out of her mind. Most men considered women to be naturally submissive and irrational and therefore unfit for citizenship. Now, instead of full participation, early Republican writers began emphasizing this idea of Republican motherhood, that really the true role of an American woman should be to raise children, to raise them, and to emphasize this idea of republicanism, of citizenship, of morals and ethics. That really should be the role of the women as the Republican mother. And even then, you have this emphasis on what we call this uh, companionate marriage. In other words, that yes, your husband owns legal and political rights, but you are a companion. You are partners in raising this ideal Republican family. So, needless to say, obviously, despite the fact that, or despite the hope of many women that this would kind of mark a new beginning in society, it is one that found itself to be very, very similar, right? And women will continue to be oppressed both legally, politically, and economically, right? However, you will slowly see at the end of this class women kind of finally kind of pushing off this oppression and gaining, I guess, what you would call full citizenship and standing. But we'll talk more about that as we go along. Okay, so like I said, I just wanted to keep this short and sweet. I just wanted to kind of go over a couple things. Um, Again, just please, keep in mind that this particular chapter will be covered in your next exam. If you read this during the break, or if you're listening to this during the breaks, I'm sorry. Have a good rest of the break, and we'll see you all over the next 8 weeks. All right, thank you all.